Hi, I'm Pastor Steve Talmage of Love of Christ Lutheran Church in Mesa, Arizona. Each week, Pastor Nanette Christopherson and I seek to provide a brief introduction to two of the assigned Bible readings for the upcoming Sunday. In this lesson, we're going to look at the Gospel assigned for Sunday, February 12th, 2023. It's a look at Matthew 5:21-37. We continue in the Sermon on the Mount, and some of you have been taught and have learned that chapters 5 to 7 of Matthew are called the Sermon on the Mount. It's one continuous a message from Jesus to his disciples. And some have even called it the handbook on discipleship. If you want to know what it means to follow Jesus, then this is the corpus that you want to look at. Jesus is not talking about a way of salvation. Jesus is talking about a way of righteous living. And there's a strong contrast between the way of Jesus and the way of the scribes and the Pharisees in the context of first century Israel. It provides clarity on what a repentant life looks like. What does it mean to reorient one's life around God and God's priorities? Verses 17 to 20 leading into our gospel, Jesus makes it clear in verse 17 that he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Jesus is the fulfillment of what the prophets promised and what the prophets called the people of God to be. And he's also the fulfillment of what Moses proclaimed in the Ten Commandments. Jesus is going to show us what it means to follow those commandments in a way that reflects how God intended for us to live with each other. So often you hear people say, well, I don't read the Old Testament because it's just full of a bunch of legalism and laws and hellfire and damnation. I'm just gonna read the New Testament because that's pointing me to heaven and the way to salvation. But notice it's Jesus saying we need to pay attention to the law, and that he didn't come to get rid of it, but to fulfill it as a means of showing us how we're to live with each other. He also invites the disciples to see the law not as a burden, but as a gift. So often we look at the commandments as, these tablets that we got to carry on our shoulders or be beaten over the head with. But really, the commandments are a gift because they show us exactly how God wants us to live in relationship with him and with our neighbor, with our family, how we can become a blessed community. The practice of discipleship is a call to any follower of Jesus. That's why we often say here, we're not concerned about getting more members of Love of Christ Lutheran Church. Our purpose as a church is to grow disciples and followers of Jesus. The practice of discipleship is not a means for comparing oneself to others, but to reflect the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Again, it's often been said that Christians are so heavenly minded they're no earthly good. Jesus is trying to tell us through this sermon that God placed us here with a purpose, and that purpose is to reflect what it means to allow God to rule our heart, what it means to try to live in community in the way that God would have us live in community. And the Ten Commandments provide us with clear guidance. What does that mean? In 21 to 48 of chapter 5, Jesus introduces 6 examples with the words, "You have heard, but I say to you." He shows how the principles expressed in the law are meant to be applied. So rather than just fixating on saying, this is what the law says, I follow it, Jesus says, really? Do you really follow it? Because it's a little broader than maybe we make it out to be. In every case, the standard of practice or application is raised from the current reality. Jesus is an observer of life. He's observing the people. He's observing what the Pharisees and the scribes are teaching the people, what rabbis are teaching the people. And in every case, he raises the standard because he's calling us to be more and better than the minimum. Jesus is preaching and teaching about owning the truth that sin starts in our mind and our will. Again, when we look at the Ten Commandments, we say, well, I don't do that because I haven't externally acted on that in a way that is clearly obvious. I haven't killed somebody. I haven't committed adultery. I haven't stolen from my neighbor. But Jesus is saying, look at your thoughts. Look at the words that bounce around in your head about your neighbor, about your family, about yourself even. Reorientation, gaining God's perspective, listening to God's priorities is critical. In verses 21 to 22, Jesus talks about the law of murder. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you'll be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you'll be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you'll be liable to the hell of fire. Jesus uses hyperbole, strong exaggeration to make a point. And what he's doing here is, whether you and I pull a trigger or pull out a knife and stab somebody, we physically take a life or not, doesn't matter. We often degrade, we often put down, we often think in our mind or with our words, do damage to another person. We dehumanize, or we treat them less than. And so here Jesus is saying, we need to understand the responsibility we have to our neighbor. And that's to see them as a child of God, created in God's image. And they have worth and value because God made them. And our words and our actions do matter. So whether or not we pull a trigger or pull out a knife and stab somebody and physically actually take the life of another isn't the main thrust of this commandment. The thrust is, how are we speaking about and treating our neighbor or family member? I put in here a picture of Jerusalem and Mount Olives and Behinnom Valley because the word hell is translated from the word Gehenna. And that's a physical place, actual place outside of Jerusalem. Mount Moriah is where the Dome of the Rock is, and that's in Jerusalem. And down in this valley was the garbage dump. It also was a place prior to Jesus where human sacrifice was made. But there was often smoke and fire and burning, and so that was the image of hell. Then we move from how we speak and act regarding the law of murder to the law of reconciliation. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave. Leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms as quickly as with your accuser while you're on the way to court with him. Or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you'll be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you'll never get out till you've paid the last penny. Reconciliation, restoration. This is key to being a follower of Jesus. And the burden is on us who've either offended or been offended. We have a responsibility to go to the person, the offending party or the offended party, and seek a path of restoration and reconciliation. We can't control the outcome. We can't control how they respond. But we have an obligation in obedience to the commandment of Jesus, to the teaching of Jesus, to go and try to work things out. Now that may mean you're never going to be best friends again, or you may have to have physical distance from one another. It may mean if you've gotten a divorce that you're not going to get remarried. But you want the hostility between you to be over and to be able to live at peace with the other. And it's on us as disciples to do what we can to seek reconciliation and restoration. The next one is the law of adultery. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. Again, Jesus is inviting his followers to not objectify the other. to treat our neighbor as a fellow human being. And obviously, most of us don't violate this law by going and having sex with a married person. We respect the bonds of marriage, and we can say, I haven't broken this one. But then we all might remember the infamous words of Jimmy Carter when he's interviewed by Playboy magazine that he's had lust in his heart. He's being honest. As human beings, we are made to be attracted to others. And we know the temptation, and we know the emotions. We know the hormones that flow through all of us. And so therefore, Jesus is saying, pay attention. Pay attention how you look at others. And pay attention that you look at others not as an object to satisfy some emotional, physical, sexual need, but you see others as brothers and sisters, as fellow children of God, and treat them accordingly. Have high regard for people who are married and don't interfere in the marriage of another. But in reality, whenever we look at another human being with eyes that seek to exploit them, take advantage of them, or use them for our benefit, it's wrong. It's wrong. And then we get to the law of divorce. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of unchastity causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. We could spend the whole lesson on this little passage, but we're not going to. The reality is Jesus is taking seriously the need to protect women. Because in his day, a man could divorce his wife for burning the toast. He has the right to get rid of her, not just for unchastity or committing adultery. And so he's providing a kind of a hedge of protection to take seriously our marriage vows. And to take seriously that it has, if divorce is going to be the result of the ending of a marriage, there has to be serious cause for that. We live in a totally different world now, and we know that divorce can happen very quickly. Jesus is trying to protect women, particularly in this passage, because if they get divorced, they lose the protection that comes from the man's family. And her family has to live with the shame of having a daughter who's been let go, released, divorced. That's why the whole Mary and Joseph thing was scandalous, and Joseph had a right to get rid of Mary, put her away, but he chose not to. Jesus is inviting his followers, though divorce is allowable, sometimes necessary, we need to acknowledge that it has a ripple effect too. And in this case, he amplifies that all of us carry those relationships into whatever future relationships we have as well. And the hope is that when marriages are in trouble and are struggling, effort is made to find healing and restoration. But as one who's had 3 sisters dissolve their marriages, I know divorce is real. I know the pain that comes, and I know the abuse that has happened in relationships that make divorce necessary. So be careful with this passage and how it's used, but see it as a way of Jesus protecting women. And then finally, not in our lesson, but concluding, he has the law of non-resistance and the law of love. Again, Jesus is a proponent of non-violence. So, in conclusion, the purpose of these expansions or higher standards to what has previously been said or done is reveal the likeness of God at work in and through the followers of Jesus. We know we can never achieve perfection, be without sin, but this cannot be an excuse for not seeking the higher path. So again, the goal here, listening to Jesus, following Jesus, we reflect Jesus and the ways of God in our ordinary, everyday lives, with our family, with our neighbor, with the world. Take care. God bless.